Zara didn't scream when she hit the ground. She had learned over 2 years in that house that screaming only made things worse, so she lay there on the frozen sidewalk in front of 14 Millbrook Drive, wearing nothing but a thin gray coat 2 sizes too small, her bare feet pressing into the snow, staring up at a sky that offered her nothing. No stars, no moon, no mercy, just white, just cold. Just the sound of wind tearing through the oak trees like it wanted to strip them bare too. Behind her, through the frosted glass panel of the door, she could see the warm amber glow of a living room light. She could see the shadow of Diane Marsh walking away, without looking back, not once. Zara pulled herself to her feet. Her fingers were already going numb. She didn't have a phone. She didn't have shoes. She didn't have anywhere to go. So she walked. 3 blocks, 4. The blizzard thickened around her like something alive, something deliberate, like the storm itself had been hired to finish what Diane Marsh had started. By the 6th block, her legs stopped listening to her. By the 7th, her vision began to blur at the edges, soft, white, quiet. She thought distantly that this was probably what dying felt like, not violent, just dimming. She collapsed against a chain-link fence at the corner of Hartwell and Ninth, and that's when the headlights found her. 2 beams of white light cutting through the storm like blades, a black SUV, long and low, completely out of place on this crumbling side street at midnight in a blizzard. It slowed, stopped. The door opened. That was the night everything changed. But to understand what that night meant, you have to understand what came before it. Zara Osei was 16 years old. She had been in the foster care system since she was 9, the year her mother died of an undiagnosed heart condition, and her father, a man she had never met, failed to appear in any courtroom, on any document, in any form. She had moved through 3 placements before landing at the Marsh House in Coldfield, Ohio, and on the surface, the Marsh House looked like a blessing. Gerald Marsh was a regional insurance manager. Diane sat on the board of the Coldfield Community Foundation and organized the annual holiday food drive. Their children, Brandon and Tiffany, attended private school. The house was clean, the lawn was trimmed, the Christmas lights went up every November 28th without fail. Nobody outside those walls knew what Zara's life was like inside them. She slept in the utility room, not a bedroom converted to a utility space, an actual utility room with a washer and dryer and a cot folded out beside the water heater. She was told this was temporary. For 2 years, she was told this was temporary. She ate after the family, whatever was left. On nights when Gerald had friends over and Diane performed generosity for guests, Zara ate well. On ordinary Tuesdays, she sometimes didn't eat at all. Brandon had a nickname for her. He called her the Grant, not because of her last name, because of the $840 the state sent to the Marsh family every month for taking her in. Gerald had explained it to Brandon over dinner one night, laughing, that Zara was basically a recurring revenue stream. Brandon found this hysterical. He repeated it to his friends. Some of them had classes with Zara at Coldfield High. She heard it in the hallways. But the monthly stipend was only part of it. What Diane and Gerald had never told a single soul was that Zara had a trust fund. Her mother, Yemi Osei, had been careful. She had known her heart was weak. She had known the odds. So she had quietly and meticulously built a small financial safety net, a life insurance policy worth $42,000, and a modest trust intended to be released to Zara at 18 for education and living expenses. Yemi had appointed a guardian oversight clause requiring the foster family to submit annual disclosures to the trust administrator. Gerald Marsh figured out how to route around that clause within 4 months. By the time Zara turned 16, $31,000 of her mother's money had been quietly drained through management fees, housing supplementation claims, and an elaborate paper trail that Gerald had constructed with surgical precision. Brandon's private school tuition, Tiffany's equestrian lessons, a weekend trip to Cancun the family took in March and called an educational enrichment experience on the disbursement form.
Zara didn't know any of this. She just knew she was hungry, that she was tired, that Brandon threw her backpack in the trash twice a week for entertainment, that Diane, when she made a mistake, would look at her with a flatness behind the eyes that was worse than anger. It was indifference, the particular cruelty of being looked at and not seen. The night Diane threw her out, it had been over a sweater. Tiffany's sweater had gone missing, cream-colored cashmere. Diane found it on Zara's cot in the utility room because Zara, cold, always cold, beside the rattling water heater, had borrowed it without asking. Diane's voice had been very quiet, calmer than yelling would have been. "Get out of my house." And then the door, and then the snow. But the Marsh family didn't know, couldn't have known, that someone had been watching. The man who stepped out of the black SUV was not the kind of man you forgot. Tall, late 30s, Korean, and clean-cut in a way that felt expensive even in the middle of a blizzard. Long dark coat, no hat, unbothered by the wind the way certain people are unbothered by things that destroy everyone else. His name was Jin Kale, and in certain rooms of certain cities, that name was spoken the way you speak about weather, not because you caused it, because you understood without needing to be told that it was coming whether you wanted it or not. Jin Kale ran the East Shore Network, a web of financial arrangements and strategic influence that operated in the space between legal and unlawful with the elegance of a man who had spent his entire life finding those spaces and furnishing them. He wasn't a violent man by preference, he was a precise one. Tonight, he had been returning from a clean, uneventful meeting, nothing that required the thing in the glove compartment or the tension in his driver's shoulders. And then his headlights found a girl collapsed against a fence in a snowstorm wearing no shoes. "Keep driving," said Sue, the man behind the wheel. Sue had been Jin Kale's right hand for 11 years, not a cruel man, but a practical one. Jin already had his door open. "Pull over." Sue pulled over. Jin crouched beside Zara in the snow. She was barely conscious, her lips the color of a bruise, her fingers curled in on themselves. He didn't hesitate. He lifted her. She was light, devastatingly light, the weight of someone who hadn't been eating, and he carried her to the SUV without a word. Sue watched this in the rearview mirror for a long moment. Then he drove. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of the Vantage Tower in downtown Coldfield. Zara would not understand when she woke that the sheets she was lying in cost more than most people's monthly rent, or that the room, warm and softly lit, smelling of cedar and something floral she couldn't name, was larger than the entire ground floor of the Marsh house. She would not understand any of that. She would only understand that she was warm. She woke at 3 in the afternoon the next day. A woman, mid-40s and calm, introduced herself as Dr. Sarah and was checking her blood pressure. There was an IV in Zara's arm. There were blankets. There was a glass of water and a bowl of something that smelled like it had been made with actual care. "Where am I?" Zara asked. "Safe. Drink the water first, slowly." Zara drank, and then, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she cried. Not because she was sad, because the water was warm and someone had handed it to her on purpose, and it was almost too much to understand. Jin Kale appeared in the doorway an hour later. He didn't enter the room. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, studying her with the quality of a man who gathered information before speaking, who treated silence as useful. "I'm Jin," he said. "Zara. Do you have somewhere to go, Zara?" I almost laughed. "No." He nodded once, like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then you can stay here until you do. No conditions, no expectations. You're not in debt to me." She looked at him for a long time. In her experience, nothing came without conditions. Nothing came without a cost. But there was something in his face, not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition, like he had seen this expression on a person before and understood exactly what it meant, that made him believe him. "Okay," she said. Jin Kale was not a man who let things go uninvestigated. The morning after Zara arrived, while she slept, he asked Sue to find out what he could about the girl. Within 6 hours, Sue had her full case file and placed it on Jin's kitchen counter between his coffee and his phone. Jin read it twice. By the second reading, his jaw was set. The trust fund discrepancy wasn't buried, it wasn't subtle. To anyone who knew how to read financial documents, and Jin Kale knew how to read financial documents better than most forensic accountants, the pattern was obvious. Gerald Marsh had been siphoning a dead woman's money from her orphaned child for 2 years, documented just carefully enough to survive a casual audit, and not carefully enough to survive a serious one, which meant Gerald Marsh had never expected anyone serious to look. He was right, until now. Jin picked up his phone. "Get me everything on Gerald Marsh," he said. "Employment, finances, licenses, liabilities."
And his wife, Diane. I want her charity records. Everything public and everything that should be public but isn't. This is the family? Sue asked. Yes. A pause. We're doing this? We're doing this. Meanwhile, Zara was exploring. She moved through the penthouse with the careful wonder of someone who had been told repeatedly that beautiful things were not for her. She touched the edge of the marble counter. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window for almost 20 minutes, watching the city below, watching normal people walking normal streets, trying to understand how she had ended up 70 floors above them. She found the small home office off the main corridor, rows of screens, a server rack, cables arranged with the cleanliness of someone who thought of technology as architecture. She sat down, and her fingers moved across the keyboard before she made a conscious decision to touch it. She had always been good with computers, better than good. At Coldfield High, before she stopped going regularly because Diane wouldn't sign the permission forms, Zara had placed second in a regional cybersecurity challenge. Her teacher had emailed the Marsh House 3 times, suggesting enrichment programs. Diane had not responded to any of them. Here, alone in Jin Kale's office, Zara felt something she hadn't felt in years, something close to herself. She ran a diagnostic on the building's security system out of habit, found 3 inefficiencies she could have fixed in an afternoon, made a note, closed the terminal. When Jin appeared in the doorway, she turned around expecting to be in trouble. He looked at the screen, then at her. "You ran a diagnostic? I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. You found the relay gap on the east corridor?" She blinked. "Yes. I've been meaning to close that." He pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "Show me." That was how it started, not with a dramatic declaration, not with a speech, just 2 people sitting in front of a screen, one teaching the other, both understanding something that didn't need to be said out loud, that they were more similar than they were different, that they had both been underestimated, that they had both survived things designed to reduce them. Later that night, over food, actual food with flavor and substance, Jin told her carefully what he had found in her case files. She was very still while he explained. "How much?" she asked. $31,000. She stared at the table. "That was my mother's." "I know. She worked her whole life to—" Zara stopped. Her voice was under control. She had a lot of practice keeping her voice under control. "They took my mother's money." "Yes." She looked up at him. "What are you going to do about it?" Jin Kale's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A door, opening slightly. "Everything," he said. What followed was not loud. That was the thing people who weren't in Jin Kale's world didn't understand. They expected fire and confrontation and violence. Jin Kale didn't deal in drama. He dealt in architecture. He built things, and when the situation required, he dismantled them, beam by beam, quietly, in the correct order, so that by the time anyone realized the structure was gone, it was already gone. It started with Gerald's employer. Sue passed a carefully compiled package of financial irregularities, all cross-referenced against Gerald's insurance licensing filings, to a state regulatory contact who owed Jin Kale a favor from 2019.
The contact filed a formal review request, standard procedure. Gerald received a letter on Thursday requesting documentation. The documentation did not hold up. Within 3 weeks, Gerald Marsh was placed on administrative leave pending a forensic audit of his client accounts. Because when you teach a man to fraudulently route money, you also teach him habits. And Gerald had been routing small sums through client accounts for years, long before Zara, long before the trust fund. The Zara situation was simply the door that let the auditors inside. Within a few months, his license was suspended. His employer terminated his contract. Gerald Marsh, who had spent 15 years building a reputation as a reliable professional in Coldfield's business community, was quietly and completely removed from that community in the span of a month. Diane's unraveling was different, more personal. Jin had Sue compile her charity's financial records, all public, all accessible, none of which had ever been scrutinized because Diane Marsh was well-liked, and her food drive raised $20,000 every holiday season, and nobody checks on people they like. What Sue found was a pattern of small redirections, catering expenses that didn't match invoices, vendor payments to a company that shared an address with Gerald's insurance office. Nothing individually criminal, but collectively, when laid out in a clean 2-page summary and delivered anonymously to 3 board members of the Coldfield Community Foundation, sufficient to trigger an emergency governance review. Diane received a call on a Saturday morning asking her to step down while the matter was being examined. She called Gerald. Gerald didn't answer. Gerald was meeting with a lawyer. Brandon's scholarship, a need-based academic grant awarded under financial disclosures that dramatically underrepresented the Marsh family's income, was reviewed by the scholarship committee after an anonymous tip. The review found the disclosures fraudulent. The scholarship was revoked. Brandon, who had been coasting through his first year at university on money that did not belong to him, received a bill for the year's tuition. He called his mother. His mother was composing a public statement. She didn't answer. The day the bank froze the Marsh family's primary account, pending investigation of the fraudulent trust disbursements, Gerald came home to find Diane sitting at the kitchen table with a look on her face he had never seen before. The look of a woman understanding for the first time that the floor she had been standing on had never been solid. "What did you do?" she said. "Nothing that anyone can prove." But his voice wasn't steady. He was wrong about that. Back at the Vantage Tower, Zara watched the legal updates come in through the filing system she had helped Sue configure. She didn't celebrate. She didn't feel the satisfaction she had imagined. What she felt was quieter than that, more interior, like a pressure she had been carrying in her chest, one she hadn't even had a name for, was very slowly being released. Jin found her at the window that evening. "It's working," she said. "Yes. Is it enough? No amount of money is enough to replace what they took. But this isn't about enough. It's about correct. They build their life on something stolen. We're returning it to its correct owner. That's all." She looked at him. "You do this a lot? Correct things?" Something shifted in his expression, almost a smile. "Not like this. Usually it's more commercial. But you did it for me?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was different, less controlled. "I had someone, when I was young, who did something like this for me. I didn't understand it at the time. I think I understand it better now." She didn't press him. She didn't need to. But power attracts enemies, and while Jin Kale had been focused on the Marsh family, something else had been building at the edges of his world. The attack came on a Wednesday night at 11:47 p.m. It wasn't random. It was Yo Tan, a rival operator from the Western Corridor who had been watching Jin's Eastern accounts tighten and concluded, incorrectly, that the recent weeks of distraction meant Jin Kale was weakened. Yo Tan was the kind of man who mistook stillness for weakness. It was a mistake people usually only made once with Jin Kale. The first sign was the elevator system going dark. Building security failed on floors 68 through 70. The secondary alarm didn't trigger. It didn't trigger because someone had disabled it 6 minutes before the breach, which is why instead of an alarm, Zara's screen lit up with an intrusion flag she had personally coded into the system 10 days ago, running on a separate circuit nobody from the outside knew about. She was awake. She was always awake late. Old habits from years of lying in a utility room listening to a family that wasn't hers move through a house she was not allowed to fully inhabit. She saw the flag. She understood immediately what it meant. She didn't freeze. She locked the residential floors, rerouted the service elevator to a maintenance sub-basement, triggered the emergency lighting sequence to give Jin's security team maximum visibility while simultaneously cutting visual access on the approach corridors used by the intruders. Then she called Jin. He picked up on the first ring. "I see it," he said. "I've locked floors 70 and 71, rerouted their elevator access. You have a clean window through the north stairwell. I've got lights on your team's position." A pause. He could hear movement on his end, controlled, rapid. "Stay in the office," he said. "Don't—" "I know, I'm not moving." "Jin—" She hesitated. "Sue went to the 68th floor 10 minutes ago. He's not responding." Brief silence. "Keep the lock on floors 70 and 71. I'll handle Sue." What followed was 22 minutes that Zara experienced primarily through screens and audio feeds. She tracked positions. She rerouted. She found a gap in the intruder's approach pattern, 2 teams moving south, not accounting for Jin's people already repositioned in the north, and she sent a single line to Jin's
tactical channel. North stairwell, second team, 4 personnel, moving up. That message saved 2 lives. It was Sue who found her afterward, still at the screens, hands steady but breathing too fast. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Sue, who had told Jin to keep driving. Sue, who had spent weeks regarding her with the polite wariness of a man unsure of an unknown variable. He looked at her like someone he had miscalculated. "You coded the secondary circuit," he said. "3 weeks ago, I noticed the gap. The message about the north stairwell. I tracked their movement pattern." Sue nodded slowly. "2 of my people are standing up because of that message." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Jin appeared in the doorway behind Sue. He was unhurt. He looked at Zara, at the screens, at her hands on the keyboard, at the position data still updating on her display, and something in his expression settled into a kind of certainty, like a question he had been carrying had just been answered. "You're not a guest here," he said. "I know. I mean," he shook his head, and for once, Jin Kale looked like he was choosing words the way ordinary people do, imperfectly, carefully, because the right ones mattered. "I mean, you were never a burden. You were never someone I was doing a favor for. You are—" Another pause. "You're here. This is yours as much as mine." Zara looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to her screens because someone had to keep monitoring, and said simply, "I know that too." 3 days after the siege, Zara's legal representative made a discovery that had not been in any of the original files. The trust fund, the one Gerald Marsh had been draining for 2 years, had a secondary administrator, a backup oversight party appointed by Yemi Osei in the original trust documents, designed to serve as a failsafe if the primary guardian defaulted on their disclosure obligations. That secondary administrator was a man named Clarence Osei, Zara's father's brother, an uncle she had never been told existed. Yemi had not trusted Zara's father, but she had trusted his brother, a quiet and responsible man in Columbus who had tried twice to make contact with the foster care system after Yemi's death, and been told both times by a caseworker on Gerald Insurance Office payroll that Zara had been placed with a family and contact was not currently in her best interest. The caseworker had been receiving $200 a month from a routing account connected to Gerald Insurance Office. When Zara received this information, she sat with it for a very long time, not crying, past crying, existing in the particular stillness of someone absorbing a recalibration of their entire history.
understanding that she had not been entirely alone, that someone had been looking for her, that the loneliness had been manufactured. Jin drove her to Columbus himself. Clarence Osei was 51 years old and kept photos of his brother's family on the mantel of his apartment, including one of a 7-year-old Zara with her mother at a birthday party that Zara didn't remember being taken. He opened the door and looked at her and said very quietly, "I have been looking for you for 7 years." She didn't say anything. She just stepped forward. He put his arms around her, and Zara Osei, who had been thrown into a blizzard with no shoes and no one and nothing, stood in the hallway of her uncle's apartment and held on. Jin waited in the car. Sue, sitting beside him, watched through the windshield and said nothing for several minutes. Then he spoke. "You could have told her sooner about the uncle. The legal team found it 3 days ago." Still, Sue glanced at him. "You didn't have to drive her yourself." Jin didn't answer. "It was good," Sue said quietly. "What you did, it was good before she helped us, before the system, before the siege, when she was just a girl in the snow, and you could have kept driving." Jin was quiet for a long moment. "I know," he said. The confrontation with the Marsh family happened 1 week later. A formal conference room, legal representatives on both sides. Gerald and Diane had been advised by their own lawyers to attend, to cooperate, to reduce potential criminal liability through voluntary restitution. Gerald arrived looking like a man who had been systematically dismantled and knew it. Diane wore the expression she always wore in public, composed and polished, but it didn't hold the way it used to. The edges were fraying. Zara sat across the table from them. She had chosen her own clothes that morning, not the new things Jin had offered, good things, expensive things, but her own things, bought with money she had earned. Simple. Hers. She looked at Gerald and Diane for a long time. She let them feel it. Gerald started to speak. She held up one hand. He stopped. "I'm not here for you," she said. Her voice was even, not cold, even. The steadiness of someone who has moved through fire and come out the other side, not hardened, but clarified. "You took $31,000 that my mother spent her whole life saving for me. You took 2 years of my life. You took a school program that might have changed everything earlier. You took a caseworker's integrity so my uncle couldn't find me." She paused. "I'm not going to list everything. You already know everything." Diane opened her mouth. "I don't want an apology," Zara said. "Not unkind, just final. An apology means nothing to me. What I want is for every dollar to be returned to the trust with the interest outlined in the legal documents your lawyers have already reviewed." She slid a folder across the table. "What I want is for the record to reflect what actually happened in that house, so that no other child ends up in a utility room because you needed new appliances." She slid another folder. "And I want my case officially closed, with full documentation forwarded to the State Licensing Board, the County Social Services Review Committee, and the Nonprofit Governance Council that oversaw my mother's trust." She stood up. "I don't want revenge. I want to be free of you. And I want to make sure you never have the opportunity to do this to anyone else again." She walked to the door, paused. "My mother would have said something kind here. She was better than me." She looked back at them one last time. "But she was also better than you, which is why you're sitting there, and I'm walking out." She walked out. 3 months later, Zara stood on the balcony of the Vantage Tower, not Jin's balcony, her balcony, 1 floor down, in the apartment that now bore her name on a lease. She paid for it herself from the consulting contract she had signed with the security firm Sue had recommended after the siege. She had started community college in January, declared a focus in computer science and network architecture. She met Clarence Osei for dinner every Thursday since Columbus. She was learning slowly what it meant to have family. The trust fund had been fully restored, with interest. Gerald Marsh had surrendered his insurance license and entered a repayment agreement with the State Recovery Office. Diane's charity had been formally dissolved and its remaining funds redistributed. Brandon's scholarship debt was his own to manage.
The caseworker had been removed from the system. None of it brought Yemi Osei back, but Zara stood in the morning light and felt her mother in the shape of her own hands, in the way she had been built to survive things that should have broken her, and hadn't. She stood in the light and understood, not as an idea, but as a lived fact settling into her bones, that she was not what was done to her. She was what she had done with it. Jin appeared in the doorway behind her, coffee in both hands, unhurried as always. He handed her one without ceremony. She took it. They stood there in companionable silence for a while, like people do when words would only be smaller than the moment. "I've been thinking," she said. "You're always thinking. I want to do something with what I know, about the system, the way foster placements work, the way trust oversight fails, the way—" She stopped, started again. "There are other kids, in other utility rooms, and nobody's running diagnostics on that problem." Jin considered this. "That's not a small thing." "No," she agreed, "it's not." He was quiet. Then, "What do you need?" And Zara Osei, who had been thrown into a blizzard with no shoes and no one and nothing, smiled. Not bravely, not for anyone watching, just genuinely. The smile of someone who had found their direction and knew it was right. "I'll let you know," she said. Below them, the city moved. The morning light spread across the skyline like something that had been promised and finally arrived. They tried to bury her in the snow, but they forgot. Snow melts.